So we're now going to move to Ankit Kalda, who's going to present what was his job market paper. I don't think Jordan's was your job market paper, right? It was a different grad school paper, but this is Ankit's job market paper. So it's a great example of how you can kind of do this type of work and be successful on the job market.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much, Johannes and Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would echo Jordan that you're doing a great service to the profession by opening this up to everyone. I was actually attending the first session, and I had a lot of fun, and I completely agree that the panel discussion was super informative. I learned a lot from it. So anybody who's here, I would strongly encourage them to keep continuing to come to the sessions. I'm sure all of them are going to be amazing. So I'll talk about my job market paper, and one thing that I realized as I was updating my slides yesterday was, now that I haven't looked at this paper for a while because it's been accepted like last year, so I was amazed at how much I forgot about my own work. Like I could not say more than just the baseline result and perhaps the empirical strategy that I was using. And so when I went through the slides, I realized, oh, okay. And then sometimes I went like, oh, this was good work. I mean, Teresa was talking to Jordan about the job market paper and how special it is. And so obviously this paper is going to be special to me. So it's a pleasure to talk about this work. And you are going to see like common themes, which you have already seen with Teresa in the introduction, and then Johannes and Jordan's presentations, and along two dimensions, right? So first dimension is why peer effects. And clearly, all of us seem to be talking about the information channel, and this paper is also going to be about the information channel. And then it's going to be empirical challenges, right? And it's going to come down to the same challenges. So I am going to talk about measurement and common shocks in my setting and how I sort of overcome it. All right, so diving right in. So we know from existing work that household leverage plays an important role in driving economic fluctuations, right? And so household leverage is extremely important. And so it is important to understand some of the determinants of these leverage choices. And what I was really interested in is to explore some of the role of some of the beliefs and preferences that households hold, especially about distress, as a potential determinant of the demand for leverage. And so when I started out, like I had a very naive sort of a framework in mind where I was just thinking of the trade-off theory, but instead of firms, I was just thinking of it for the households. And so I was like, well, if I were to apply the trade-off theory for households, then it would just be like, I'm trading off the benefits from borrowing to the costs associated with borrowing. Some of the benefits, of course, are smoothing consumption, and the cost would be that the cost of distress might increase, right? And of course, when you're talking about the trade-off theory, these are expectations about the cost of distress, right? And so here's where the peer distress experiences come in. Because it is an important source of information on cost of distress, right? And so, again, as I said, earlier presentations have already talked about peer effects being an important source of information, and especially for parameters which are difficult for individuals to estimate, right? So even for a sophisticated individual, for instance, it might be difficult to get an expectation of what the cost of distress would look like for them. Right? And this is particularly complicated by the fact that this cost varies both geographically and even within region. Right? For instance, in the US, wage garnishment laws are very different across states. If you default on your auto loan, then car repossessing laws are very different across states. Right? So given these differences, it becomes even more difficult for individuals to understand what their cost of distress is going to be. And so I'll be talking about the peers' distress experience as a source of information based on which you can form, based on which individuals can form their own beliefs about the cost of distress. This could potentially also change their preferences, especially if you think about a model where you consider time varying preferences. And this is one of those things which Johannes was also talking about. If this is not really central to your paper, then perhaps best to not fight for it. And so what I ended up doing here is I ended up clubbing together preferences and information, though I personally think it is coming from information. But in a strict sense, I can never perfectly rule out preferences. And so as we move forward, when I talk about beliefs, it's broadly defined where I'm also talking about preferences. And then again, this is also something that came up in earlier presentations, that another reason why peer effects might be important is that it can potentially have macroeconomic implications, right? So for instance, you can think about a very simple exercise. Suppose that an individual who who experiences distress, suppose they affect their peers, right? So suppose, for instance, an individual affects 5 peers around them and changes beliefs about the cost of distress, which ultimately would change their borrowing and savings behavior, then this could multiply very quickly, right, into the social network. So for instance, consider given the fact that defaults and financial distress is relatively not uncommon in the US. So for instance, in 2016 alone, over 6 million individuals defaulted on the loan. So if 6 million individuals experience distress, and if each of them affect 5 peers, then this would mean that 30 million individuals might be changing their borrowing behavior, at least on average, in 2016 alone. Right? So potentially this could have substantial macroeconomic implications in terms of total household borrowing and savings that we observe in the US. And I will talk about a little bit in terms of the back of the envelope calculations that I do. So what are some of the main findings? So I find that peer distress, so once someone observes their peer go through distress, on average, that leads to a decline in individual leverage and debt. Right? So if I observe my peer go through distress, and I'll be talking about who my peer is, then on average, I would reduce my leverage and I would reduce debt. And this happens on the intensive margin, right? So it's not like I'm changing my decision to purchase a new car or I'm changing my decision to purchase a new house, but it's just that conditional on purchasing those things, I'm just borrowing less. So instead of purchasing maybe a $25,000 car, maybe I'm just purchasing a $21,000 car. Maybe I'm just purchasing a house which is 2 blocks down the road, but perhaps it's $30,000 cheaper, which would reflect my beliefs about the cost of distress. This also happens as individuals pay higher fractions of their debt, right? So their leverage can decline either by borrowing less or by paying higher fractions of their debt. And it seems like both of those things are happening simultaneously. Now, if you think about leverage here, leverage is going to be defined as debt to income. So potentially leverage could also change if somehow income is changing, which is the denominator. But I find that income remains constant, but these individuals, they do save more, right? So they are borrowing less and saving more while their income remains constant. As a result, these individuals are less likely to become delinquent and have better credit scores. Right? And when we talk about the mechanisms, I'll talk about some of the heterogeneity that I find, and especially trying to rule out the keeping up with the Joneses story, right? So the idea there would be, oh, if you see your peer purchasing good things or purchasing certain things, then you might be more likely to purchase those things. In my setting, it's the other way around. So imagine I have a peer who keeps buying new things, and I am always trying to keep up with them. suddenly they go through distress. Now they are no longer purchasing, let's say, a new car every 2 years, or they are not purchasing new clothes or new watches every couple of months. So that reduces my incentives to purchase these items if I was doing it to keep up with their consumption, right? And so that could lead to me borrowing less. But I would find some really nice heterogeneity that would help rule out that type of behavior. And specifically, one of my, personally, the result that I find really interesting is it really depends on your priors, right? So if it is about information, and if it is about change in beliefs, then it should be a function of an individual's prior. And so if I look at heterogeneity based on, let's say, ex ante leverage, right, what I find is that those individuals who ex ante had higher levels of leverage and debt, they do reduce their leverage and debt. However, those who had very low levels of ex ante leverage and debt, they are actually increasing leverage following the peers' experience. And so the idea here is that those individuals who ex ante had lower levels of leverage were perhaps overestimating the cost of financial distress. So once they observe their peer, they find, oh, perhaps it's not as bad as I had thought, right? And so they revise their expectations in the downward direction. However, those who had higher levels of leverage, they are doing the opposite. And then I do some simple back of the envelope calculations, which you should always take with a grain of salt because there are a number of assumptions that go in there. But the purpose of this exercise is to show, look, there could be economically meaningful aggregate effects, even though these particular estimates, which I am finding here through these back of the envelope calculations, cannot be fully trusted, right? So my estimates would suggest that these types of peer effects that happen through distress could explain a decline of up to $213 billion in household debt over a 4-year period between 2011 and 2015. And I'm doing this exercise for this period because my data only goes from 2010 to 2015. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the data that I'm using, and then we'll move on to the empirical challenges, which again, you've already seen in other settings. So the data that I use is anonymized data. This comes from Equifax. And just in case somebody doesn't know what Equifax is, it's essentially a credit bureau. And they receive these credit histories from all lenders in the US, or most lenders in the US. About all the applications and about all the loan originations that they receive and that they make. And this data also follows the loan on a monthly basis, right? So on the credit side of this data, what I'm going to have is I'll have credit histories for about 220 million individuals. But then Equifax also has this other business where they provide some employment verification services. And I don't really want to go into that, but essentially that is going to provide me with some payroll information for about 30 million individuals. And what I'll be doing is I'll be using an intersection of these two data sets, as this would allow me to overcome some of these challenges for instance, of measurement or common shocks. Right? So the first empirical challenge, again, is with the definition. And as Jordan pointed out, not everybody would have a really neat setting that Johannes and Teresa have with the Facebook data. So you would have to define peers in a way and then make an assumption that these individuals are interacting with each other. Right? So ideally, for instance, in my setting, what I would want to ideally observe is that there are these two individuals who do interact with each other. And not only that, ideally, I would also want to observe that, hey, they are interacting to each other about financial distress, because for some people, financial distress might be a matter of shame, for instance, and so they might want to try to hide it, right? So in an ideal setting, I want to see two people who are talking to each other. One goes through financial distress and they share their financial distress experience with the other, right? But obviously I don't have that granularity of the data. So I'm going to try to define peers in as close of a manner as possible, right? So that it increases the likelihood that these individuals do interact with each other. And hopefully they also talk about their financial distress experience, right? And even though I cannot directly observe whether or not they are talking about financial distress experiences, I'm hoping that the accumulation of all the evidence would convince you that it's a reasonable assumption to make. Right? So peers in my setting are defined as individuals who both live in the same zip code and work for the same firm with the same job title. Right? So, for example, think of two cashiers working for Walmart and living in the same zip code, or two assembly line workers working for GM and living in the same zip code. Right? Now, defining peers in such a close fashion is a double-edged sword, right? So in one sense, on the one side, it helps me because it increases the likelihood that they interact with each other. But on the other hand, it exacerbates the common shocks problem, because these individuals, because they are working for the same firm, maybe they are subject to firm level shocks, right? Because they also reside in the same zip code, maybe they are also subject to geographic level shocks, right? And so to try to overcome that, I'll be using a difference in difference setting, which I find best to explain through this figure. So think of three workers, all of whom work for GM, and let's say all of whom are assembly line workers. So they work for the same firm and they have the same job title, right? But Linda and Mike, they also live in the same zip code. So in my setting, they are peers, but Nancy lives in a neighboring state, right? And so the setting that I'll use is I'll look at instances where Linda experiences a health shock, which drives her to financial distress, right? Which would be defined as defaulting on your medical bill, which is worth more than $10,000. And the reason for that $10,000 cutoff is that I wanted to stay away from the fact that perhaps this individual's only defaulted on, let's say, their monthly payment. Suppose they had made a regular visit to the doctor, but somehow went into financial distress, which led them default on their payment to the doctor, right? So to try to get away from that and try to get closer to the health shock causing the financial distress, I have this $10,000 cutoff. And then all Mikes, which are peers to Linda, are going to be the treated individuals in my definitive setting. And all Nancys, which again work for the same firm with the same job title, but reside in a neighboring state, are going to be my control group. Right? Now, one can talk about the fact that, okay, so perhaps this would allow me to throw in firm by time fixed effect. So it helps control for firm level shocks. But what about zip code level shocks, right? The fact that Linda and Mike reside in the same area and Nancy resides far away means that both Linda and Mike are susceptible to common geography level shocks, right? And so a potential alternative to this empirical design could have been this. Maybe I could have used Eric as a control variable, as a control, where essentially Eric is going to be a security guard who also works for GM and resides in the same zip code, right? So this would really help me control for both zip code level conditions and for firm level conditions, right? Both designs have their own pros and cons. Again, I've mentioned the advantage of this design. The disadvantage is that because Eric also resides in the same zip code, it's possible that Eric is also in the social network with Linda, right? So it's possible that Eric is also exposed to Linda's financial shock. So in which case, I would essentially be underestimating the true effect, right? Because the control group would also get affected by the treatment. In an ideal setting, you want the treated to be affected by the treatment and the control group to be not affected, right? And so given these pros and cons, so here again, I've talked about the disadvantage, but the advantage is that because the control group lives far away, Nancy is less likely to be in the same peer group as Linda, and so less likely to be affected by Linda's health shock or Linda's financial distress, which was induced by a health shock, right? So when I was thinking about this, to me, it sounded like it basically boils down to your own preferences, because both designs have their own pros and cons. So I obviously implemented both, and I have results for both in the paper, but my preferred one is this first one, just because I feel like it's cleaner in the sense that the control group does not get affected by the treatment. Of course, there is this issue that there might be geography level shocks, and to help with that, I did a number of robustness checks. For example, I look at whether Mike's income changes, I look at whether zip code level economic conditions change, so on and so forth. But I can completely understand if somebody says, oh, I would prefer the second design because even if it gives you an underestimate of the true effect, but it actually more cleanly identifies it, right? So to me, it sounds like it's more a matter of preference. So once I have this setting, then I'm going to be using the standard definitive setting, where pre and post would be defined by when the health shock or when the financial distress to the treated's peer individual occurs. And then peer shock would be essentially would identify all Mikes whose peers are getting affected by financial distress. Okay, so Jordan did talk about this in his talk, and I also wanted to again emphasize this, that whenever we have a data set which we know is not representative or does not include everyone, it's extremely important to talk about how that sample compares with the population, right? So if you don't have the population in the data set, then of course you do need to talk about this. It matters for for external validity, and I think it helps the reader think through some of the limitations that the analysis might have. And so I don't really want to go into the representativeness, but I just want to highlight. So here, what I ended up doing is, the reason I don't have the entire population is because the employment data only comes from those employers who subscribe to these employment verification services provided by Equifax. The credit data, on the other hand, is the entire population, but I'm using the intersection of the two. And so in the paper, I provide how the individuals in the employment data are different from individuals in the population, both in terms of their credit outcomes and also in terms of employment outcomes. Right? And so I have a couple of examples of the plots on here, where essentially I'm comparing how these individuals look based on their credit card borrowing, how they look in terms of their credit score. They seem to be looking very similar. In terms of employment, on the other hand, at the individual level, they look very similar. So an average individual makes a similar income in the employment data that an average employee in the US would make. But what's different is the employment data comes more from the larger employers. So even though in terms of observables, these individuals don't look very different from the population, the fact that they are working for large employers of the world, they might be different on certain unobservable dimensions. Okay, so let me move on to the results. It looks like I have about 6 minutes. Uh, so my first result is how does peer distress affect individual leverage and debt? And again, I'll be using the difference in difference setting. And what I find is that the debt to income ratio, again, leverage here is defined as debt to income ratio. It declines by about 5.7% for the treated individuals related to the control group as measured by the sample mean. Right? Now, the identifying assumption here is that of parallel trends, right? That is to say, in the absence of this treatment, both treated and the control groups would have followed a parallel path. And of course, we cannot verify the entire assumption in the data, but we can look at how this assumption looks like in the pre-period, or how at least the trends look like in the pre-period, right? And so that's what this plot is doing. So essentially, I have interacted my definitive variable. I've split it into event time. So I've interacted the peer shock variable with event times in months, which are presented on the x-axis. The y-axis simply represents the coefficient estimates. And what I find is that in the pre-period, there is no statistical difference in the way that the treated and control individuals leverage was moving. But in the post period, it seems like treated individuals leverage declines significantly more than the control individuals. Next, I examined what types of debt do individuals reduce, right? Because this is just about total leverage and total debt. Now I want to look at whether this is coming from credit card borrowing or auto loans or mortgage loans, and it seems to be coming from all three, right? So individuals seem to be declining, debt seems to be declining across different products. Similar types of trends when you look at the dynamics of these plots. Because I'm running short on time, I'll just go through quickly the next two results because I would really like to talk about the mechanism more. So the next thing that I look at is how are individuals reducing this debt, right? Because it may be surprising that somebody would decide not to purchase a car or not to purchase a house if they observe their peer go through distress. And so what I find is that so I look at this separately for each type of debt. So here I'm showing you the results of credit card debt, but it's similar results for auto and mortgages, that this reduction is happening on the intensive margin. So borrowers are borrowing less on the intensive margin while they are paying higher fractions of the debt, right? As I said earlier, I did look at income and employment because both the treated and and their peer might be subject to common economic conditions. So it seems like their income and likelihood of employment does not change for the treated group. And their savings also increase, which is a result which I'm not showing you here. As a result of these adjustments, these individuals are less likely to be delinquent and they have better credit scores. Right? So let's move on to the mechanism. So the mechanism that I had in mind and that I think is going on is that individuals are learning about the cost of distress or the likelihood of distress. So their expectations about the cost of distress is changing. But an alternative might be that this might be coming through the social utility channel, which is keeping up with the Joneses. And so in order to provide evidence consistent with one channel and to rule out the other ones, I look at a number of cross-sectionals. I'll just briefly mention two cross-sectional tests. So this one is looking at what type of cost did the peer experience. Right? So if you default on the health shock, which is defined as defaulting on the medical bills. So if an individual defaults on the medical bills, then their wages may potentially be garnished, which is great because there is a lot of heterogeneity in wage garnishment restrictions at the state level. So I can exploit those restrictions to look at how that is impacting my result, because those individuals whose wages would be garnished more, for them the cost of distress would be higher, but for the other ones whose wages cannot be garnished, their cost of distress would potentially be lower, right? And so I split the states into three buckets. States which have no restriction on wage garnishment. So in these states, most wage garnishment occurs. States where there are some restrictions on wage garnishment, and then states where there are severe restrictions on wage garnishment. So effectively, no wages are garnished, right? And what I find is that most of the results are concentrated in states where garnishment does occur, and peers in states where no garnishment occurs are not really reacting, which essentially is suggesting that only those treated individuals are reacting, or at least those treated individuals are reacting more, whose peers experience a more costly distress related to those treated individuals whose peers experience a less costly distress. And the final result that I also talked about earlier was to look at how this varies by the treated individuals' priors, right? And as a proxy for the treated individuals' prior, I'm looking at their ex ante leverage, right? So if I look at the deciles of the ex ante leverage, it seems that individuals who are in the top 5 deciles, they are the ones who are reducing their leverage post peers' financial distress, but those who are actually in the bottom one are increasing their debt and leverage. Right? So I would just skip a few slides and just conclude. So what I'm consistent with some of the other papers, the idea here is to just talk about how information flows from the peers' experience. And what I show is that hopefully I would have convinced you with the collection of results that what's really happening is that individuals are learning from their peers' distress experience and updating their beliefs and preferences. And that is changing their own borrowing behavior and savings behavior moving forward.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ankit. This is great. And I think you also have, a few questions in the chat which you can respond to. So we're going to take a few minutes break, and then we're going to have two papers that that take a different stab at solving the same types of research design problems. And it's by design, not by accident, that you see that every one of the papers presents really tries to focus on how do we overcome the measurement challenge? How do we define the peer group? How do we overcome the identification challenge? What can we learn about potential mechanisms, etc. Right? It gives you kind of the sense that every paper is grappling with this, and every paper and every presenter talks about their approach to solving these issues. It really kind of helps you understand what really the central parts are, in terms of writing a convincing peer effects paper. And then sort of the other things are the bigger picture questions about aggregate effects. Ankit had his back of the envelope calculation, etc. But really sort of thinking hard about how am I going to measure peers and how I'm going to identify it, I think is really helpful. And so I think, Jordan had sort of one of these, sort of great example of random peer group assignment type example. Ankit had more like a random shock to your network. And I think the next two papers we're going to see, in a few minutes, Florian and Emily Breza's paper are going to use more, more sort of, field experiment research designs, which, are also going to be very helpful here. So I think we'll come back to kind of discussing these in the panel down the road, but really, through the papers, we wanted to give you sort of a broad selection of the various approaches to solving it, but really, sort of focusing also on this common theme that you should see across each of these papers, which is that in this literature, the problems are very common, they're very well known, and there are sort of techniques that people have developed over time to solve them. And so, when you want to write one of these papers, your job is to essentially try and figure out which of these techniques best applies to the specific setting that you have in mind.